Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. The Texas Navy safeguarded the Texas coastline for nearly 10 years, a proud, if lesser known, facet of the fight to forge and maintain a free and independent Texas. Today we reveal the humble origins of the Texas Navy, the expensive yet effective efforts to bolster the seafaring force, and how a power struggle between its commander and a war hero president culminated in a voyage to the Navy's final battle. I'm your host, Emily Baucom. Today we are joined by author and independent historian Jonathan Jordan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Emily, thanks for having me.
You wrote a book called Lone Star Navy. What made you want to do such a deep dive into the Texas Navy?
Well, it started off in Dallas County Court number 5 in a hallway. I was arguing a case back then, and I was waiting outside the Dallas County Court, Superior Court, for, I think, a jury to finish up. And in the hallway outside, there was a colorful picture depicting the Navy of the Republic of Texas capturing the island of Cozumel off the Mexican coast. The little plaque mentioned that the Texas Navy had claimed that island for Texas. And I always thought, wow, that was a nice resort. Why didn't we keep it? And it got me thinking, why did Texas even have a Navy? It's a place with cactuses and deserts and cowboys. And I got intrigued by the idea that Texas had a Navy. In fact, I found out it had 2 navies and was a geopolitical player in the 1840s. And that's what got me started into, as you say, a deep dive on the Texas Navy.
Inspiration can strike in surprising places. Texas has a 300-mile coastline, and in the run-up to the Texas Revolution, multiple countries had a naval presence in the Gulf.
That's true. The 2 biggest players, of course, were Mexico and the United States. Mexico, we think of it as the country it is today, but it was a genuine multicultural empire back in its heyday. Its territory ran from basically Colorado and Utah all the way down to the Yucatan Peninsula. That's a lot of coastline it had to control, and after the Mexican Revolution that won its independence from Spain, it took over some of the Spanish ships of the Spanish Navy and had a fleet that was active in the Gulf of Mexico. The United States on its side had an interest in protecting New Orleans. It's the 3rd largest port in the country, and making sure that trade between Europe, the United States, and Mexico was flowing uninterrupted. So both those countries were heavily involved in the Gulf of Mexico. Other European powers like Great Britain and France also had their warships going around the Caribbean from time to time.
You write about how Santa Anna was much more interested in a land campaign, so that left an opening for Texas to take to the sea.
It did, along with Sam Houston and a lot of other land-based generals, tended to think in terms of land campaigns. And if you look at a map, the closest points, the straight line running from Veracruz or Mexico City to Galveston, the heart of the Texas Revolution, cuts across the Gulf of Mexico. But as a land commander, General Santa Anna was much more concerned with taking the important points, Goliad, of course, San Antonio's the Alamo, of course, and then the heart of the Texas Revolution in East Texas. And he saw that the best way to do that was to march an army and just basically clear out the Texians from the land area. But that did give the Texians a couple of openings. The sea was, of course, the easiest way to get from New Orleans to Galveston. And so we see a lot of volunteer troops, a lot of guns, a lot of supplies and ammunition being run from New Orleans, which was basically the breadbasket of the Texas Revolution, and those came across the sea. In addition, if Mexico wanted to supply its army, as we'll talk about later, the best way to do that was to send a merchant fleet overseas across the Gulf of Mexico to feed Santa Anna's army. But if Texas was able to field a fleet of warships, they had an opening to interrupt those supplies. These were the things that land generals tend not to think about, but sea captains are very interested in.
When Texas starts a Navy during the Revolution, they initially turn to the private sector. Why is that?
Well, there were 2 things the Texas government was short on: time and money. The interim Texas government simply lacked the funds, the volunteer funds, the contributions. It lacked anything needed to build up a true Navy at the very beginning. And we're talking around September 1835. So they turned to the private sector. And that started off with a schooner named the San Felipe. It was a small gun runner that ran between New Orleans and Galveston until in the fall of 1835 it sank off Matagorda. There was also a three-gun merchant ship named the William Robbins that rescued a Texas gun runner, which had been captured by a Mexican warship. There were also a number of small private vessels that helped with the Texas Revolution, such as the schooner Flash and the steamboat Yellowstone. They served during the Revolution. Flash carried refugees near Galveston during the famed runaway scrape and briefly carried a couple of cannons nicknamed the Twin Sisters, which eventually, as we know, made it to Sam Houston's army in time for the Battle of San Jacinto. The steamboat Yellowstone carried a volunteer unit known as the Mobile Grays from New Orleans to Galveston. And so in this way, these private vessels were pressed into Texas service and made small but important contributions to the success of the Revolution.
For sure, but obviously privateers are not a permanent solution. So how did Texas go about building a navy mid-revolution?
The Texas government realized that we can't just rely on private companies and privateers. That was a stopgap solution, and it always was. In January 1836, the Texas government sent purchasing agents out to New Orleans and other places to find some vessels that were either suited for military service or could be converted quickly. And they found four of them. The first one was the schooner Liberty. Now, we think about ships of this era, such as the USS Constitution or the big British ships like the HMS Victory. But the ships that we had in the Texas Revolution, both on the Mexican side and the Texas side, were very small. Around the Gulf of Mexico, the ports were much smaller than the big ones you had in Europe. Really, New Orleans was about the only place you could get a true man-of-war, and even that would be a tight squeeze. So it was far more feasible to use these smaller vessels, and a schooner is a two-masted vessel that is very, very tiny compared to the Constitution, but they're quick and they can get in and out of shallow harbors. And at the time, Galveston had a relatively shallow harbor, about 8 to 10 feet of depth at the bar. So the schooner Liberty was the first one that was picked up by the Texas government. It was formerly the privateer named William Robbins, and it had 5 guns of different types. And with the purchase of the Liberty, the Texas government could have a vessel that it could control and didn't have to just hope would do the right thing. Another schooner that the Texas government purchased was the Baltimore schooner Invincible. The Invincible was a fast vessel originally built for the illegal slave trade. It was very quick. It was good for carrying 8 or 9 guns. The New York schooner Independence was the third vessel purchased for Texas. It started its life as a U.S. Coast Guard revenue cutter, so it would go in and out of harbors looking for smugglers who were trying to evade tariffs, and it became the flagship of the first Texas Navy. While finally the main schooner Brutus, 7 guns, was purchased in New Orleans, and those 4 ships, the Independence, the Liberty, the Invincible, and the Brutus, rounded out what we call the first Texas Navy. Like I said, they were small vessels, so they weren't even actually formally ships. They were vessels of war.
On the second floor of the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, we have several Texas Navy uniform plates from around 1836 on display, so I encourage all of our listeners to come check those out. Now, you write that after the hot war of the Revolution ended, a warm war of sorts began, with the Texas Navy right in the middle of the action.
Yeah, at this point, remember, the Battle of San Jacinto ended in April 1836. General Filisola was the second in command and still commanded a very large army, much larger than the Texian army after the Battle of San Jacinto. That battle had defeated Santa Anna's advance guard. Of course, it captured the leader and created a truce. Mexico's army withdrew back into the Mexican interior, but it was still quite a threat to Texas. There was really no end to the war officially, no peace treaty between the Texas and Mexican governments that was was of any legal value or any practical value. And as a result, we have the Mexican government trying to figure out what it needs to do to recapture Texas. It had a burning desire to recover this national insult. And so one of the things that Mexico realized it needed to do was pinch off supplies coming from New Orleans, and it had to squeeze Texas. And when Texas became a formal independent nation, it was looking to do whatever it could to either starve or impoverish or ultimately reconquer Texas. But both sides had to go into something of a truce because they also didn't have the money to continue a heavy war.
Right, financial problems with creditors in Texas pop up almost immediately.
They do, and that's where we see first cracks in the Texas business model. The Liberty was sent back to New Orleans in January 1836. It needed some refitting, and ultimately the shipwrights in New Orleans made a bunch of repairs to it, but then they realized we don't have a way to pay for it. Now, if you take your car into a shop, you get some work done, and then you say, I can't pay you for it, the auto shop's not going to let you have your car back. That's what happened to the Liberty. It was eventually sold to pay its debts. That was the first vessel that was lost in the Texas Navy. The Texas government in early 1836 found that it had the money to buy ships, but that's just the beginning of the costs of the Navy. You've got to pay the individuals, you've got to pay the sailors, you've got to pay the officers, you've got to keep them fed, you've got to keep them supplied. It's not like something where you buy the ship and you hire some men and then it moves on its own. There's a lot of upkeep to a vessel that sits in the water all day, and that became a real problem for the rest of the Texas government's career.
There's a sea battle that takes place shortly after the Revolution that ends with a Texas ship surrendering to Mexico. Tell us what happened.
The Independence, you'll recall, was the flagship of the Texas Navy. And in 1837, April of 1837, so we're a year after the Battle of San Jacinto, a year during this time of Cold War between Mexico and the Republic of Texas, Captain George Wheelwright, the commander of the Texas Navy, was sailing the Independence back from New Orleans to Texas. Now, the schooner Independence was undermanned at the time. She didn't have enough men to work more than half of her guns. Her commander was hoping that he could slip past the Mexican warships that were prowling the Gulf of Mexico and make it safely to the harbors of Texas before they found her. But as he approached the mouth of the Brazos River, Captain Wheelwright's ship was jumped by the Mexican brigs Libertador, which had 16 guns, and Vencedor del Alamo, which had 9 guns. So he was very badly outgunned, even if he had a full complement of crew. And unfortunately for him, he was overtaken by the brigs. The schooners are very good when they have to maneuver in adverse winds. But if you got a tailwind, brigs, like the 2-mast vessels that the Mexicans used, are faster in a straightaway. The Independence was overtaken. She traded fire with the 2 brigs for a couple of hours. The Mexican vessels came in. They would dash in, unloose a broadside, and then dash back out. And ultimately, the Independence's sails were sliced up. Her decks were bashed up. Captain Wheelwright was injured when a cannon shot hit the side of the vessel and sent wooden splinters flying, and he had to be taken below decks. So after this battle, just off-site of the shore at Velasco, Texas, Independence struck her colors and surrendered. And there were a lot of Texans who had gathered to watch this battle out on the banks of the shore. They saw the vessel, the Independence, the flagship of the Texas fleet, surrendered to the Mexican Navy. One of her guns, as it turns out, brass 8-pounder, was a trophy that had been captured from Santa Anna's army at San Jacinto. It had been engraved with the initials of many of the prominent society ladies of Texas. That was a trophy that the Mexican government was able to trumpet, as well as the capture of the Independence.
Meantime, war hero Sam Houston has become the first president of Texas. And you make the argument he didn't really understand or have an appreciation for how navies work.
That's true, Emily. Like so many generals of that time and really up through the Second World War, he was focused on how you run a land campaign. For almost 200 years, there's been a running philosophical battle between the Navy mind and the military mind. Generals tend to look at land campaigns. The Navy tends to think of themselves then and now, we can even see this in recruiting commercials today, as the front line of defense. The Navy thinks of projecting power overseas and how you do damage to the other side, how you prevent the other side from getting to your coast. And that was the mentality of the Texas Navy secretaries, the Texas Navy captains. Sam Houston's mentality was, how do I defend the territory of Texas? He believed that an army could be created on relatively short notice, with a few professional soldiers leading essentially a militia, the types that would grab the musket off the fireplace and assemble at the muster point. He believed that he could use a land army to defend Texas the way he had during the Revolution, and that the Navy's role was to act as essentially a coastal artillery. It should stay close to the shore. It should protect the integrity of Texas. It shouldn't go off on long cruises or try to hit Mexico far off, because that would leave the coastline undefended. That mentality soon came into sharp conflict with the naval leaders of Texas, who had been humiliated by the loss of the independence and were looking for revenge.
Also, around this time, there is no money in the state coffers, and it feels like Texas has a Navy on paper only.
It does. What happened is during 1837 is that it lost its first Texas Navy. You'll recall that the Liberty was lost because it couldn't pay its bills. The Independence had been captured, and that left two vessels, the schooners Invincible and Brutus. Those were probably the most effective vessels in the Texas Navy. They were large. They had enough guns to operate offensively. After the humiliation of the Independence's capture in April 1837, the Secretary of the Texas Navy, Samuel Rhodes Fisher, who had actually been one of those people on the banks watching the Independence surrender, had ordered the Invincible and Brutus to cruise down the Mexican coast to capture Mexican shipping, to raid cities. And he did this in defiance of orders from Sam Houston, who told him not to go enrage Mexico. Sam Houston did not want the diplomatic cart to be upset in 1837. He wanted to make sure that Texas was safe from a Mexican invasion again, and that he did nothing to antagonize Mexico into another war. He had hoped that Texas could become annexed to the United States, which was under President Andrew Jackson at the time, Sam Houston's mentor, and he wanted to keep things quiet on the Mexican front. But the Independence and Brutus went down the Mexican coast from June to August of 1837. They hit some small coastal villages like Isla de Mujeres, and they captured the island of Cozumel, claiming it for Texas. According to the ship's account, they captured the island, they landed there, they found a flagpole, and they raised the Texas flag over the island. They made the few inhabitants they could find in that village around there swear allegiance to Texas, and then they sailed off 24 hours later, leaving the villagers to go back to their lives the way it was before. Kind of curious about what that was all about. After capturing Cozumel, after capturing a few merchant ships and a mail carrier, the two vessels came back to Texas. Brutus made it safely across the Galveston Bar, but the tide went down that day before the Invincible could get into the safety of the Galveston harbor, so she had to stay outside at night. The next morning, she found she was facing two Mexican warships, the 16-gun brig Iturbide and the Libertador. The Invincible fought the two Mexican warships throughout the day, but it was outgunned, and when the Brutus tried to come to her rescue, Brutus got stranded on a sandbar in Galveston's harbor and lost her rudder. The Invincible's captain tried to rush into the harbor, but he also got stuck. The bar was pretty shallow and the tide wasn't deep enough. She got stuck, the waves hit her, she tipped over and broke up during the night. And a month later, a hurricane hit Galveston and finished off the Brutus, ending the first Texas Navy. And that's when the Texas Congress got serious about rebuilding a Navy.
And we start to see two key partners in this emerge. Who are they?
The first one was President Mirabeau B. Lamar. He was a Georgian who became the cavalry commander at San Jacinto and second president of the Republic of Texas. The other partner was Commodore Edwin Ward Moore, a lieutenant in the United States Navy, who knew he had much better chances of promotion, of fame, of action overseas by leaving the U.S. Navy and joining the Texas Navy. Mirbeau Lamar had a very different vision of Texas from what Sam Houston's was. Houston thought of Texas as something that was best annexed to the United States. He could seek the safety of a much larger country and get Texas on a better financial footing if it were part of the state. Sam Houston was also a fiscal conservative who believed that the government shouldn't be spending money it didn't have. His motto was fewer officers and more farmers, and he was very careful about not spending much. Mirbeau Lamar took the diametrically opposed view of Sam Houston. He didn't want Texas annexed to the United States. He wanted it to become a great regional power, possibly even an empire, taking over Mexican possessions as far as California. He was unconcerned with some financial risk, and during his administration, they printed up something that was nicknamed redbacks, a kind of paper currency that was really just backed by the faith and credit of the Texas government, and really had very little to back that faith and credit other than just a lot of land, hundreds of thousands of acres, but that was about it. And Mirbeau Lamar was willing to put the money the Texas government did not have into a navy that would project power overseas, that would allow Texas to become a genuine player in the Gulf of Mexico and an independent quasi-empire on its own.
And Lamar and Moore really go on kind of a shopping spree to make this happen.
Yeah, they do. The Texas government starts out by purchasing a number of vessels. They start out by buying a Philadelphia steamer, and they outfitted her as a warship, the 8-gun Zavala. Now, steam power was an important technological advance back then, because if you had bad wind, if you had no wind, you could use a steam-driven vessel, not just as a warship, but also as a motor to tow your heavier warships into place. So you had some mobility as long as you had steam power, and the 8-gun steamer ship Zavala was one of the most technologically advanced ships in the world when she was purchased in 1839. The Texas government also appropriated over $500,000 to buy a number of other vessels. They bought 3 war schooners, each with 5 to 7 guns. These were the San Antonio, the San Jacinto, and the San Bernard. They bought a couple of war brigs, which are also 2-masted vessels, the Branch Archer and the Wharton, which had 16 guns apiece. And last but not least, in fact, last but most, the Texas government purchased the sloop of war Colorado and renamed her the Austin. The Austin was the only true ship in the Texas Navy. It was a sloop of war mounting up to 20 guns and 3 masts. It was about 400 tons and was the largest thing Texas ever fielded.
Our conversation continues after this message.
This is Charlie Crockett, Texas musician and descendant of Davy Crockett, inviting you to visit the Alamo. It's not the same Alamo you, remember. There's lots of new things to experience, like the 500 artifacts inside the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, the new Mission Gate and Lunette outdoor exhibit, and surrounded, the Alamo Augmented Experience. It's all part of an ongoing restoration and expansion that will write the Alamo's next chapter. So don't wait. Plan your visit today at thealamo.org.
Welcome back to the Alamo podcast. A cool note about Commodore Moore: in the book, you have a photo of him in his Texas Navy uniform. The Alamo actually has a uniform that is believed to be Moore's in our vault. It's hard to tell if it's the same one as in this photo, but it's very similar and a very cool connection.
It is a neat connection, and the thing to remember is that Texas was kind of taking supplies, taking uniforms, taking everything where it could. So the Texas Navy's regulations were based on the United States regulations. The United States Navy's regulations were based on the Royal Navy's regulations in Britain. So there were copy and paste jobs there. Basically, Texas had to borrow as much as it could from the Navy rather than try to build up its own traditions and its own rules and its own weapon supplies from scratch.
That also included how they hired sailors and kind of skirted some rules to recruit directly from the U.S. Navy.
They did. In the winter of 1839 to 40, Commodore Moore went up to New York. That was an area that he was very familiar with, being a U.S. Navy officer. They went up to the Brooklyn Naval Yard, and he was cordially welcomed by the New Yorkers. The sailors were welcomed by the bars and other merchants in the New York area. He was there for one reason, and that was to recruit a crew for his different vessels. Now, the United States had very strict neutrality laws, and no one was allowed to recruit on U.S. territory. Commodore Moore and his men went out to places around the wharfs, to bars, places like that, and quietly offered $20 bonuses for people to join the Navy, filled them with drinks and with tales of adventure, heroism, and prize money that was to be gained by sailing for Texas. And they were able to recruit a lot of men. That was highly illegal, and Commodore Moore got into some trouble there. The Texas agents were able to keep him at liberty and out of jail long enough for him to get back on the warship and get back to Texas with his crew.
This is really the heyday of this Second Texas Navy, as you put it. What are their key successes?
The Texas Navy's first jobs were to instill a sense of professionalism among the sailors and the officers. And Commodore Moore spent a lot of time fitting the ships out, getting the men trained, getting the ships in shipshape order, as it were. He also, as a way of training some of them when they didn't have a war to fight, sent one of his vessels down the coast of Texas to do a coastal survey. We talked earlier about how the Invincible and the Brutus were lost trying to get over the sandbar in Galveston. There were a lot of places in Texas where ships just couldn't go because they didn't know how deep the water was, and he mapped out the Texas coastline so that both merchant vessels and military vessels could get in and out of Texas safely. That was not a military operation, but it did have a lasting impact on the Texas economy by reducing insurance rates for vessels and making it safer to sail around the Texas coast.
They're also making diplomatic missions to the Yucatan Peninsula, and that's about to become a really key part of our story here.
It is. This is one of those cases of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Texas was not the only place where the Mexican government, based in Mexico City, was having trouble maintaining control. Remember, Mexico was this large multicultural empire, and there were many regions that felt themselves very distant from the central government of Mexico. Around the Rio Grande River, there were a lot of separatists, and Texas was encouraging them under President Lamar. In Yucatan, where the people were ethnically more Mayan than the Aztec Spanish mix found around Mexico City, they were also in revolt as well. And that was a place where Mirabeau Lamar concluded, this is an enemy of the Mexican government, and if we can keep the Mexican government enmeshed in putting down revolts in Yucatan, in northern Mexico, down in other places like that, then they'll be too busy to invade us. And that was part of Lamar's strategy. And as a result, he was able to reach out and use the Texas Navy as kind of his ambassadorial force to the Yucatecos. This was not only a diplomatic story. The Texas Navy was a genuine power in the Gulf of Mexico. It was arguably the most technologically advanced force in the world because it had a steam-powered warship, which the United States didn't have. The British Royal Navy was only beginning to look at on a serious basis. The Texas Navy became a vital link between Texas and Yucatan and was therefore able to protect Texas by keeping Mexico preoccupied.
Well, that link is about to be tested. Commodore Moore loses his ally in President Lamar when Sam Houston gets reelected president. Moore sees the writing on the wall and decides to get his fleet out to sea before Inauguration Day.
Right. Sam Houston had been burned in 1837 when the Texas Navy defied his orders and went off to ravage the coast of Mexico. He wasn't going to let that happen again. He understood how headstrong the Navy leaders were and how they saw things differently than he did. Again, his goal was to avoid provocations of Mexico, and he also understood that Texas did not have the financial means or the military to defend itself. Sam Houston wanted to make sure that as soon as he was president, the Navy stayed in port, and Commodore Moore was careful to get his ships out of Texas waters and away from messenger boats where he could receive orders to come back to Texas before Sam Houston became president. He went down to the Texas coast and sailed along those waters. He didn't do a whole lot of fighting there, but the Mexican government knew that Texas was out there. Whether they liked it or not, the Texans controlled the coast for a while.
Sam Houston has some grievances with the Navy when he takes office again. It's over money, and he does not like this alliance with the Yucatan Peninsula.
He doesn't like it one bit because he thinks this is essentially a trap. He does not want the Texas Navy pulled down on the Mexican coast, away from the Texas coastline, where it could be vulnerable to another invasion by Santa Anna, who had been returned to power, and the Mexican army. His other concern, of course, as always, was money. The Texas Navy was running up big bills to pay sailors and officers, and it just didn't have the money to pay them. He didn't want the country to plunge deeper and deeper into insolvency trying to maintain a Navy it could not maintain. So for reasons of money and geopolitics, Sam Houston did not want the Texas Navy meddling with Yucatan.
He ends up being proven right because the Yucatan eventually negotiates a return to centralist Mexico.
After he left Texas waters, Commodore Moore went to Yucatan and carried out a arrangement that had been negotiated under the Lamar administration. Essentially, the Texas Navy was put out for rent for $8,000 per month in silver. Now, Commodore Moore saw that as a way of financing the Navy and as a way of protecting Texas by keeping Mexico City occupied in the Yucatan Peninsula. That leverage enabled Yucatan to negotiate a treaty with the centralist government of Mexico City, where the Yucatecos got greater rights, what we would recognize as states' rights in America. At that point, the government of Yucatan and Campeche, those areas of that Yucatan Peninsula, told Commodore Moore, "Thank you very much. We've been able to settle our differences with Mexico City, and we've negotiated a return to central Mexico, so we don't need you anymore." Commodore Moore is left without a reason to be down in Yucatan, so he has to reluctantly return back to Texas, which has no money to support the Navy and has no use for a Navy, certainly under Sam Houston.
On one hand, though, the Navy is a source of national pride. But as you mentioned, money remains a huge problem. Sailors are not getting paid for months on end.
They're not. Texas was in a difficult position because, on one hand, they needed a Navy. They knew that there was a threat that Santa Anna would try to reclaim Texas. And in the Mexican papers, there was always a lot of, essentially, remember San Jacinto, we've got to avenge what happened in Texas. So on one hand, Sam Houston and Texas needed a Navy. On the other hand, they could not afford to keep a Navy. So we had, as a result, a bunch of sailors and officers sitting on ships with dwindling supplies, unable to pay for not only themselves, but to pay for clothing that wore out, unable to pay for decent rations. The situation just became really, really hard for the sailors and officers. One of the consequences of this impoverishment was a mutiny that broke out in February 1842 aboard a Texas Navy schooner. The disgruntled sailors and a couple of Marines broke into the weapons locker and fired on their officers, killing one of them, and got into some boats and rowed off to New Orleans. They were captured fairly quickly, most of them were, and locked up in a New Orleans jail. But that was an example of the problems that the Navy was running into. Morale was low, the men were quitting, they were disgruntled. This became an intolerable situation for the officers and men of the Navy, in particular Commodore Moore, who was charged with keeping people from quitting.
It all comes to a head when Houston refuses to release funds that were appropriated by Congress, and Houston and Moore have a showdown. What happened?
In 1842, Commodore Moore was desperate to get funds for the Navy, and he felt that only his personal intervention with Sam Houston would get Houston to release the funds that he had been holding. Those really weren't funds. There was no real money, but there were at least promissory notes that could be used as collateral to fund the Navy, and that's what Commodore Moore wanted to do. Sam Houston, in Moore's view, had a heart of stone and was really just looking to disband the Navy while pretending he wasn't. Moore accused Houston of playing games with the Navy, playing games with the nation's security, and yelled at him. Eventually, the two men parted as bitter enemies. Houston was never going to do anything to let the Navy thrive anymore, particularly under Commodore Moore, and the venom that the two men had for each other lasted through the rest of the Navy's career. For the rest of 1842, the Navy was basically held together by Commodore Moore's personal credit his promises to get more money from the Texas government, and really some hopes in the lack of any other jobs available to some of his officers. And essentially, it was just Moore who was keeping this thing afloat, literally, until January of 1843.
Around that time, Sam Houston starts a closed-door process to sell the Texas Navy.
Yeah, Sam Houston didn't see that there was any choice. They had these ships, but the ships kept piling up bills they couldn't afford. He eventually concluded, let's just take the Navy, we'll sell it, we'll use it to buy whatever the government can get with it. And in a secret session of the Texas Congress, they passed an act to send some commissioners out to New Orleans to sell the Navy of the Republic of Texas at auction. Well, the commissioners that were sent to orchestrate the sale of the Texas Navy included one named James Morgan. Morgan was kind of the lead commissioner, and Commodore Moore's orders were not to come back to Galveston and sell the Texas Navy. They were to come back to Galveston and essentially obey the orders of the commissioners. During the few days Commissioner Morgan was in Galveston, Moore had been able to get an advance from the Yucatan government to begin to refit the Navy. He had spent a lot of time with Morgan explaining to him what the situation was in Yucatan, how the Yucatan government, which had had a falling out with the Mexican government, was now another place where they could defend Texas without being near the Texas coast. He persuaded Morgan that the ships really were something that could be used to defend Texas, and persuaded Morgan to let him come back to Galveston by way of Yucatan.
One last hurrah for Commodore Moore.
In January 1843, we begin the last great cruise of the Republic of Texas Navy. Moore pulls out of Galveston. He had taken along some of the mutineers from the February mutiny. He had them hang as an example to his crewmen. Then he sailed down to Campeche. Now, Campeche is a port city off the western coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. That was the center of a new revolt against the Mexican government. It had been blockaded by the Mexican Navy. Its citizens were under siege by the Mexican Army, and the best way to defend Campeche, and therefore defend the Republic of Texas, in Commodore Moore's mind, was to break that blockade. The only problem was Mexico had rebuilt its fleet. In fact, it not only rebuilt a fleet, it rebuilt the most technologically advanced fleet in the world. It had purchased two very heavy steamer of wars, the Moctezuma and the Guadalupe. These war steamers had shell-firing guns that were much larger than the guns that the Texas fleet had. But the Texas fleet, which was now down to just two vessels, the Austin and the brig Archer, were much more aggressively handled, much more professionally handled by the Texans. And they were able to drive off in two engagements the Mexican fleet. They battled each other. Neither side had a sunken ship, but the Texas fleet inflicted enough damage on the Mexican squadron that they pulled away. The blockade of Campeche was broken, and the Texas fleet was able to defend Yucatan long enough for the Mexican Navy to go back and for the Mexican government to concede that it wasn't going to get back to Texas because it still had too much going on at home.
Our listeners will remember our recent episode on Samuel Colt and how the Battle of Campeche was a big victory for Colt in his revolver. In reality, even though Texas holds its own and the sailors are publicly acclaimed as heroes, it's a little bit of a draw.
It is. The battle itself was a draw, but it was painted as a big victory for Texas. And to your point about Sam Colt, in 1839, the Texas Navy's shopping spree had included 180 revolving pistols manufactured by Sam Colt. Collectors later called the Texas Patterson, I think, first model. But it was a 5-shot revolver, and they also purchased 180 revolving carbines. They were basically the same thing. That rescued Sam Colt from bankruptcy, and so after the Battle of Campeche, took a scene, a fanciful engraving of the battle, and put it on the cylinder of his 1851 pistol model. That pistol became known as the 1851 Navy Colt. It had nothing to do with the Navy, but it had a picture of the Texas Navy on it. And it became one of the most widely used and manufactured pistols and one of the most used pistols in the American Civil War.
Sam Houston, though, is not happy. He did not want this battle to take place. It defied his orders. He declares Moore and his crew as pirates, traitors, and murderers.
Oh, he was furious. He fully expected that the Texas Navy would come back to Galveston under the ultimate authority of Commissioner James Morgan, and then they would sell it. That was the plan. He hadn't counted on Moore being persuasive enough or the situation being changed enough that Morgan would allow Commodore Moore to go off on a mission in Yucatan that was completely unauthorized. When the Texas ships were off the coast of Yucatan, they found out that Sam Houston had issued a proclamation declaring Commodore Moore and his officers as pirates and calling on all the nations of Christendom to seize them and bring them back to Texas for justice. When Commodore Moore saw this, he immediately knew he had to return to Texas and he had to go clear his name. So he brought his two vessels back to Galveston. They entered the harbor with great fanfare. They were wined and dined by the citizens of Galveston, who were, of course, on the front lines of any Mexican invasion of their territory. And he was treated as a hero. He offered himself under arrest to the local sheriff, who was smart enough to know not to do anything and just let Sam Houston enforce his own regulations. And Commodore Moore offered himself up for a court-martial to try charges against him. In fact, he demanded a court-martial to clear his name.
He's eventually acquitted of these charges. What's the fate of his beloved Texas Navy?
He was able to, in time, clear his name, but he wasn't able to protect the Texas Navy any longer. Ultimately, Houston was able to auction off the vessels of the Texas Navy, but even that didn't go the way he had expected. A mob showed up at the Galveston wharf and threatened to lynch anybody who had the temerity to buy the Texas warships. Ultimately, the crowd bid in the name of the Republic of Texas, and the ships basically didn't go anywhere. They eventually began to sink for lack of upkeep. That wood will rot over time. Water accumulates in the holds. The Zavala, the warship, ended up basically settling into the mud and ultimately ended up underneath a parking lot in Galveston. The other vessels just began to rot. They really were not very seaworthy. And ultimately, as we know, in 1845, Texas is annexed to the United States. And as part of annexation, the ships of the Texas Navy went to the United States government and became government property.
Really kind of an anticlimactic ending to the Texas Navy after you have this battle between Sam Houston and Commodore Moore, and then it just kind of all fades away.
It went out with a whimper, not with a bang. And ultimately, the only vessel that was able to remain afloat, the Austin, was towed off to Pensacola by the United States Navy and used for a brief time as a training vessel before it was broken up. Like so many aspects of America's military and naval history, the expense of keeping things up overtakes the equipment. And so these warships that had been used to defend the Texas coastline, to protect Texas independence, to change the course of history by buying time for Texas to negotiate its way into the United States, those kind of faded from history. People's lives went on, and the Texas Navy was more or less forgotten about for another 80 years.
I think it's fair to say most Texans don't realize we did once have a Navy. That's what started you on your journey to write this book. What would you say is the legacy of the Texas Navy that we should remember despite its troubled ending?
The Texas Navy performed two vital functions that changed Texas history and changed the history of North America. The first was aiding and protecting the armies as they fought out the land campaign during the Texas Revolution so that Texas could become an independent nation. And the second was protecting Texas from far off its coast. It's hard for us to remember the connection between Texas independence and a battle far off on the coast of Yucatan. But it was far-sighted officers such as Commodore Moore who thought outside the box, thought outside the coastline even, and knew that Texas could be protected in a lot of different ways. Between Sam Houston and Commodore Moore, there were two different visions of how to protect Texas. And while these visions clashed, the Texas Navy was an important part of Sam Houston's vision of making Texas part of the United States because it bought time for his strategy to succeed.
Texian Navy Day is marked on the third Saturday of September, so just days away. It's really cool that we still mark that day.
It is. And since the early 20th century, there have been more and more scholars who've awoken to the significance of the Texas Navy. Texas wasn't just about a land battle. It wasn't just about the Battle of San Jacinto. It was a genuine geopolitical player back in the 1840s, and the Navy played a part in the development of that geopolitical entity that we knew as the Republic of Texas and we know of today as the state of Texas.
Jonathan Jordan, thank you so much for joining us.
Emily, thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We've linked to more on his book, Lone Star Navy. We've also linked to photos of the Texas Navy uniform plates on display right now in the Alamo exhibit. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.